Welcome, everyone. I am Eve Samples. I'm Executive Director of Friends of the Everglades, and really honored to be with you today for a clean water conversation. We have a very timely topic. Today, we're going to be discussing the MCOR's toll roads. This is a hot topic in the Florida legislature right now, and we have some really interesting guests that are going to be joining us to fill you in on the latest and the impacts and what's at stake. So before I introduce our guests, I want to tell you a little bit about Friends of the Everglades and the No Roads to Ruin Coalition, which is co-hosting this event with us. So Friends of the Everglades was founded by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in 1969. We're very proud of that legacy. We're engaged in mostly grassroots advocacy on a number of environmental topics related to the Everglades. And today we're going to stray a little farther north of the Everglades proper, but what we're talking about relates to the Everglades, and I'm looking forward to explaining that. The No Roads to Ruin Coalition is a coalition of organizations and businesses that are dedicated to stopping the MCOR's toll roads for the reasons you're going to hear today. Friends of the Everglades is honored to be a member of that coalition, and we are co-hosting, as I said. So we started these clean water conversations almost a year ago now, which is hard to believe, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic as a method for helping to keep the public engaged in important environmental topics, even as we were all confined to our homes and unable to get out to public meetings, which have shifted virtual as well. And even as we're apparently opening up again as a society slowly, we've found reason to continue them because we've received a lot of interest and positive feedback. And that's particularly true today. We had many people register. We're streaming live now on YouTube and Facebook, and we just see that there's critical interest in this topic, MCORs in particular. So we're going to talk about it from a number of different regards with our guests, and then we'll have some audience Q&A at the end. So if you're watching live and you have a question, you're free to post that question in the Facebook chat or on YouTube, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end. So let me introduce our guests now. First, we have Amber Crooks. She's the Environmental Policy Manager for the Conservancy of Southwest Florida. She represents the Conservancy as a member of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Panther Recovery Implementation Team Transportation Sub-Team. That is a tongue twister.
It's a mouthful.
Right. It's a task force working to minimize wildlife that's hit on roadways. And Amber specializes in wildlife policy, water resource protection, and oil drilling issues, all very important topics in Florida. Welcome, Amber.
Thank you.
Next, we have Ryan Smart. He's the Executive Director of the Florida Springs Council, a nonprofit coalition of more than 50 conservation organizations. He was recognized in 2017 for his environmental advocacy work and when he was named the University of Florida Bob Graham Center Young Floridian of the Year. He previously served as the director of the Florida Conservation Coalition and president of Thousand Friends of Florida. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you.
Next, we have Barbara Byram. She's co-founder of Citizens for an Engaged Electorate, an activist group based in Levy County. And she's worked since 2011 to improve all lives of all Floridians. The group has been working in that regard as well. Citizens for an Engaged Electorate also has been in particular working on the MCORs issue to repeal it since its passage in 2019. Welcome, Barbara. Thanks. And I think you're muted, Barbara, but that's okay for now. Welcome. Finally, we have Commissioner Lily Rooks. She's been a Levy County Commissioner for 22 years and is a resident of Cedar Key. She's an outspoken advocate for the preservation of rural lands and livelihoods. And she remains staunchly opposed to the toll roads that we're talking about today and sees them as a threat to the environment, economy, and way of life in Levy County and across Florida. Welcome, Commissioner.
Thank you very much.
Great. So I'm going to start off by just giving an orientation to this issue, and then I'm going to turn it to you all who have deeper expertise in your individual subtopics. So we'll start off with that. And I want to share my screen so that we can orient ourselves to this topic. Okay, and thanks to Allie, who is our behind-the-scenes director at Friends of the Everglades. She makes the magic happen here. So back in 2019, the Florida legislature passed a bill to authorize design and construction of 3 new toll roads that spanned about 330 miles through rural Florida. And these were known as MCORs, the multi-use corridors of regional and economic significance. So they would have cost hundreds of millions of dollars over more than a decade, and obviously had widespread impacts due to the vast swath of the study areas that you're seeing here. So, as I said, the legislature passed the bill into law in 2019. The three corridors are the Southwest Central Florida Connector, the Suncoast Connector, and the Northern Turnpike Connector. And you see those denoted here in the three different colors on the map. And although there were concerns almost immediately as a result of these proposals, Governor DeSantis did sign it into law that year in 2019. He did that despite a veto request from 90 groups, including Friends of the Everglades and the Conservancy of Southwest Florida. So you can just look at this map and see why the concerns were so grave. This was really comparable to a new interstate system in terms of impact and cost. Nothing of this scale had really been done since the interstate system came to Florida many decades ago. So what were the biggest concerns? Thousands of acres of farms and rural land stood to be impacted, wildlife habitat fragmented, which we're going to hear more about, sprawl accelerated by the roads and the development that would follow. And really, it went against the State Department of Transportation's own advice on I-75 that the best approach to relieving highway congestion was to expand vehicle capacity of existing roads, not building new roads. So this was out of order. It was something that the former Senate president was a big fan of, and the legislature took it up, but it didn't follow the normal kind of way roads and transportation systems are developed in Florida. So opposition was very widespread. Out of about 10,000 public comments, 93% were opposed. That's according to the No Roads to Ruin Coalition. And it wasn't just environmentalists, like several of us on the call here, the discussion here. It also was opposed by Florida Tax Watch because there were really immense budgetary impacts. So 3 task forces met for many months to study these proposed corridors, 1 task force for each corridor. And in the end, they could not reach a conclusion that there was a specific need for these roads. And I think that probably could have been evident before we spent all the time and money on the task forces, but nonetheless, they reached that conclusion. So here we are, about 2 years later, and some things have changed. So I mentioned that the MCORS projects roads were a top priority for former Senate President Bill Galvano, but the current Senate President Wilton Simpson is not expressing that these roads are a priority for him. So a bill has been proposed, Senate Bill 100 in the Florida legislature, and it actually just passed the Senate yesterday, that would repeal MCORS and is an improvement over the previous plans, but it still retains the possibility of a toll road to an undetermined terminus, if you will. So there are lingering concerns about that. It was passed by the state Senate yesterday. The state House has not yet taken it up. So as we all know, when the legislature is in session, nothing is quite certain. We still have more than a month left of session. And if the House doesn't take action, we could still be stuck with MCORS in its original form. If it does take action, we may have this improved, but still in some ways concerning legislation. And that's what we're going to talk a bit about today as well. So I just wanted to orient you a bit. And one last thing I'll say in terms of the update on MCORS is that there was a bill, 2 companion bills actually filed, that would have completely repealed MCORS, and those bills went nowhere during session. So Senate Bill 100, if anything is to pass, has the greatest likelihood. That bill that would have repealed MCORS completely was filed by Senator Tina Polsky. She's a Democrat from Palm Beach County, and Representative Ben Diamond, a Democrat from St. Petersburg. Okay, so that's where we are now. And I want to just mention something else. I'm going to flip my slide here because I think about this slide a lot. This summarizes why Friends of the Everglades was created. This is a runway that was built in the middle of Big Cypress National Preserve as part of what would have become the Everglades Jetport. It was proposed in the 1960s, and in 1969, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas founded Friends of the Everglades in large part to stop this from becoming a major airport. And we were successful, and others engaged in that battle as well, but only after this first runway was built. So as we're talking about building toll roads through swaths of rural lands and wilderness in Florida, I think this is a really important image to keep in mind. Once we lay this pavement and disturb our natural and rural lands, there's really no going back. And it just so happens this runway is now a training facility in the middle of the Everglades. So with that, I do want to turn it to our guests. And Allie, you can go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Thank you. And I'm going to turn it first to Amber and want to talk a bit about your expertise on panther habitat, because we know one of the primary reasons for public opposition has been their potential devastation to Florida's native wildlife. With more roads come more vehicle collisions and kills. Roads can isolate subpopulations. So the Florida panther is probably the species that comes first to mind when we think about this. So can you tell us a little bit about how the proposed toll roads would imperil the Florida panther and perhaps reverse long-term recovery efforts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Eve, and appreciate the opportunity to represent the Conservancy today. And I think you're correct that the Florida panther has really been that flashpoint in terms of wildlife when considering the MCORS program, because this is our state mammal, critically endangered, and the panther is acutely imperiled by roadways and habitat loss that result from roadways. So I think to truly understand the threat of MCORS, the Florida panther, I think it's important to give just a quick frame of reference. And I do have some visuals, if you wouldn't mind, Allie, just to start with the next slide. I just want to give a quick frame of reference about where we're at for the Florida panther, and that the current breeding population is restricted to only about 5% of its historic range, the historic range seen in blue here. And that's largely regulated to land south of the Caloosahatchee River here in Southwest Florida, which is the red on the map. Next slide, please. The current population is far below the goals set for recovery of this animal. So in order to eliminate the threat of extinction, the panther population would need to grow from one population of about 120 to 230 panthers, which is the current estimate, to 3 populations of at least 240 panthers each. So since the Florida panther is a wide-ranging mammal with large home ranges, this, of course, is going to require additional habitat being secured, not just in South Florida, where the last remaining core exists, but well into Central and North Florida, and also likely into other states. So not only would MCORS likely result in a direct impact to habitat from the footprint of the road itself, but would accelerate development into panther habitat, increasing fragmentation, isolation, and increasing panther vehicle collisions. If you'll go to the next slide, you'll see very clearly the threat that roadkills present to the Florida panther. It is the #1 known cause of mortality for panthers. And each year we're seeing anywhere between 20 to 35 deaths, again, per year to this cause of being hit by vehicles. Next slide, please. Now, this map shows the deadliest spots for panther roadkills currently. And as you can see, this is largely Collier, Lee, and Hendry counties. These are the deadliest spots are in our rural landscapes. These are the counties that are within the Southwest Central Florida connector area. And one more slide, if you wouldn't mind. This is a much more pleasant picture. I want to highlight the fact that for the first time since 1973, beginning in about 2017, we have documented female panthers north of the Caloosahatchee River, moving into areas like Babcock Ranch, Fish Eating Creek. Again, these are areas that are within the scope of MCORS. So I hope that sort of answers the question that, Southwest Connector directly threatens panther habitat as well into the expanding areas just north of the river, where we're seeing these female panthers for the first time in decades. I think that maybe answers your question.
Yeah, it does, Amber, and thank you. So I want to dig in a little bit in particular on that last point you made, because the Big Bend areas and the Nature Coast regions, which are vulnerable even in Senate Bill 100, could be impacted. So why are those areas, even as they're so far geographically right now from current breeding habitat, why are they important as you see it? Can you go a little deeper on that?
Yes, of course. So, obviously we're first concerned with how MCORs could impact the panther in its current breeding range, but that isn't the only place important to panthers that MCORs could impact. This map, actually hot off the presses here, this is new science released just a few weeks ago that show critical lands. You can see there in the green and the blue areas that are critical for panther expansion. And you'll see that I tried to draw a little arrow so you could see that these are some of the same areas as within the MCORs projects for the Suncoast Connector and the Northern Turnpike Connector. Now, panthers don't currently frequent this area. They may be there, but not in any similar density or frequency like we have in South Florida, of course. But this study showed that there are some areas that would support additional panthers in Central and North Florida, and we're going to need those areas in order to reach those recovery goals. So we need to be thinking and planning long-term to preserve these areas for the panther.
Interesting. And I'd imagine that evidence of panthers spotted north of the Caloosahatchee is a real hopeful sign that the territory could indeed expand where we're talking about.
Yeah, we just have to lay the groundwork, and I've got some more information to share about some of how we kind of are able to achieve that.
Yeah, so and maybe this is where you're headed, but I wanted to ask you about underpasses. So when we talk about road construction in Florida, we often hear about underpasses for wildlife as being a solution or at least some mitigation. And what is your take on whether they are sufficient for protecting particularly panthers and other wildlife in Florida?
Great question. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide there. Obviously, to truly protect the Florida panther, we not only need to protect the core existing habitats needed for the future, like you saw on those last maps, but we also need to preserve travel corridors from point A to point B. And I think this gets to your question, Eve, about the wildlife underpasses like you see there on the right-hand side of the screen. They, of course, are the best way to allow safe passage across roadways, or really under roadways. Far better than like nighttime speed zones or slow speed zones, which are important too, but they rely on actions of us human drivers to actually pay attention. The underpasses are, passive ways, and they are documented to be utilized. But this is the but. You can't just slap, wildlife crossing on an improperly sited roadway and hope to completely alleviate negative impacts. They're very costly, and you may only be able to get, a few on a roadway. So for us, the focus should always be first and foremost on avoidance and minimization of the impacts before looking at things like mitigative measures like panther or wildlife crossings. And that means looking at no-build alternatives first.
That's interesting. It reminds me of a quote I saw in an article the other day. It was actually about climate change, but I think it applies here. It's that we live life looking forward, but we understand it looking backwards. So the more we can understand it looking forward, the better, I think. That's extremely helpful. Thank you. I suspect we'll have some questions from the audience about panther impacts. And if you do have questions, just a reminder to pop them into the Facebook comments, or you can include them on YouTube and we'll see those as well. Any final points on that, Amber, before we ask Brian a few questions?
Well, I could give a whole presentation about panthers, but I think that's maybe all that we have time for at the moment. Be happy to answer questions, though.
Thank you so much. All right, so we'll turn now to Brian, and I want to reflect back on the original MCORs proposal, not the scaled down version we're seeing in Senate Bill 100 that is seemingly gaining traction in the legislature. So those roads would have spanned more than 330 miles, roughly 330 miles through the heart of rural Florida, and that could still happen. So what specific concerns did the Florida Springs Council and your member organizations have about these roads' impacts on our state springs in particular, Ryan?
Thanks, Eve. Well, we've got some very important springs along that stretch, going from Weeki Wachee all the way up into the springs of the Panhandle, that were in jeopardy. And what we know is that spring flow is already down statewide 20, 30, 40%, depending on the spring system that you're looking at. And when the Department of Environmental Protection had to analyze our 30 most important, largest springs a few years ago, they found that 24 of them were impaired. So that's 80%, and that's a pretty good number you can, toss around for the thousands of springs that Florida has. So we've already got an enormous problem when it comes to overpumping, and we've got an enormous problem when it comes to too many nutrients entering the ground. These toll roads, and specifically the sprawl, the forced sprawl that was planned along with them, would do nothing but exacerbate those problems. You can't move more people into an area and hope to avoid them. So even though you hear things about, well, we could use it to, put people in septic tanks or put up on wastewater treatment instead of septic tanks, even wastewater treatment does pollute. And of course, you're going to have the additional withdrawals coming out of our springs. And springs restoration projects are heavily underfunded. We're only receiving 50 million, maybe 75 million this year in the budget for a problem that's likely 15 to 20 billion dollars. So we can't possibly be making the problem worse at a time when we can't even begin to slow the bleeding. And the money that was being put into these completely unnecessary toll roads could be much better spent on water quality projects statewide, on land conservation projects. So it's also a question of, what does our state prioritize? Do we prioritize more sprawl and more irresponsible growth? Or do we prioritize conserving rural lands, land conservation programs, restoring our water resources? Because we certainly don't have the budget at this point to do both. So we have a real crisis when it comes to our environment. I don't know anyone who thinks we have a crisis when it comes to building roads through rural areas. So it's really a matter of priorities and just trying to hold on to the last bit of those springs before they reach a tipping point where they really can't be restored the way that they still can be today.
You used a term that I want to ask you to explain a little more, forced sprawl. So can you explain what you mean by that and how the roads contribute to that?
Sure. So sprawl is kind of the history of how Florida has grown. There are some exceptions, and you're seeing more and more people try to build responsibly, but in general, we're still building single family homes with lawns that people want to water and they want to fertilize. We're still building communities that are car dependent, that don't allow for realistic public transportation options. We're still building communities in places where we just need to not build. There's all kinds of places that you can build in Florida. A lot of them have been built on, but there's a lot of places where you just can't build because you're already at a point where the environmental damage that's been done from previous development is really threatening our water supply and water quality. And because the state is not providing adequate funding for land conservation, we're no longer conserving those lands. So we're seeing more and more lands that need to be conserved end up being developed. I think the most recent legislative report found that it's like 300 years just to acquire the lands that currently need to be acquired. Those are the ones that are on list at the current funding levels, and funding levels are only going down. So it's forced sprawl because whenever you put in one of these roads, access roads, you're going to have one point where people get on and off. And one of the things that I think was really offensive to local governments about MCORs was they implied that they were going to come in and force local governments to change their comprehensive plans to allow for sprawling development by those overpasses. Or those limited access points. So that really is forced sprawl. When you're going to a local community and you're saying, look, you have to allow development here, no matter how it's going to affect existing development along existing roadways, no matter how it's going to affect existing communities, no matter what you think about your environment, we're going to come in and force this, right? And the behavior they're forcing is a behavior that's negative upon the people who are already in those communities and upon those of us that rely on our water resources. So, it's a bad thing both ways.
That's very well put. And the state legislature has a bad habit of preempting the will and interests of local communities. And that's just one more example. So let's zoom in now, Ryan, on the proposals that remain on the books in Senate Bill 100. So it repeals MCORS technically, but it would retain some funding and the possibility of the proposed extension of Florida's Turnpike from where it merges with I-75 and Wildwood to some unspecified location. What are your concerns in that particular area? And I know we don't have a corridor to point to for specific impacts, but broadly speaking.
Sure. Well, if you want to throw up my slide now, I think it kind of gives that perspective. So, that's the basic area that you can see some kind of development within. It appears that the goal is to fix US 19 and not build a new greenway, although I don't think there's anything in legislation that guarantees that. But if you look at that area down in that shaded area kind of to the south, that is where the Wildwood to Crystal River, most likely Turnpike extension would go. And all of those blue dots are Florida Springs. Especially important in that corridor are Rainbow, Kings Bay, and Homosassa. And there's a lot of very important spring sheds that cuts through, and it really isn't possible to run a new toll road or any kind of road from the Turnpike over to Crystal River without impacting those spring sheds. And Rainbow Springs, for instance, is already the pollution level is already 5 times above the legal limit in state law. And really, there's no credible way to deal with that. They've already proposed removing and replacing every septic tank in the entire Rainbow Springs and Silver Springs Basin. That would cost about $1.5 billion and only reduce about 20 to 25% of the nutrient pollution. So this certainly is not an area where we can add more pollutant inputs and expect our waters to stay healthy. Kings Bay and Homosassa are also severely impaired for nutrients. And of course, all of those are feeding into rivers that exit out into the Gulf. And those, Gulf discharges cause the problems you have in the Gulf, including all the way down into Southwest Florida. So we need to make sure that we're protecting our water quality inland before that water hits the coast, as well as preserving the natural springs and rivers.
That is very helpful to see the images. Thank you. One more for you, Ryan. Are there any specific examples of sprawling developments that have contribute very clearly to pollution of Florida springs and resulted in more overpumping? Any cautionary tales?
Right. So, I was thinking about this, and it's all of them, right? If you look at how big the springs basins are in our water basins, if you're anywhere near a river or spring, you're probably in a spring or river shed. It's just the way it goes. And almost all of our development is in those areas, and almost all of our development is sprawl. So it's like, you could randomly pick a development, but if you live north of Orlando, especially in the St. John's or Sewanee areas, you're probably in a spring shed. And if you take water out of the ground, it's going to not come out of a spring. And if you put nutrients into the ground, it is going to come out of a spring. So you can look at a lot of these communities were built before the term sprawl even existed. It was just the way Florida grew. But Live Oak, Lake City, Gainesville, Orlando, they're all they're pretty much all in some kind of a spring shed. They're all impacting the waters. But we know better now. Like now we actually when these things were being built, the idea of Florida having water problems was kind of novel. When forever the problem in Florida was getting rid of the water. There was so much water you couldn't build, so much nature. And now we've managed to do such a good job of developing and getting rid of that we're now facing the opposite problem. But our policy and our funding expenditures haven't caught up with the reality that we need to be doing more conservation and less building. And we ran willy-nilly for 100 years. At some point, you have to pay the bank. And we're getting to that point and putting money towards toll roads and new sprawling developments when we need to be doing infill. Right, we don't need to be developing in any rural areas, especially ones that don't want it, when we need to be going into communities that are suffering, having issues, and we need to be doing infill there. We need to be rejuvenating local neighborhoods. We need to be providing more condensed development that doesn't require irrigation and fertilizer. These are the kind of things we need to do because Florida is not going to stop growing. So it's not you can't put a fence up at the line. You have to figure out how you're going to accommodate these people. And new irresponsible rural developments is certainly not the way if you care about our environment or our rural communities.
Very well put. And I know one of the justifications purportedly for MCORs was hurricane evacuation, but there are many other ways to handle that as well. And these roads weren't any kind of unique solution in that regard. So I would like to turn now to Barbara. Barbara, your home county, Levy County, has a population of about 42,000 roughly, and it stands to be dramatically impacted by these roads, and even what's left in Senate Bill 100 could be impactful. So please tell us about what your concerns are right there in your community and how you got personally involved in this issue.
Okay, so as co-founder of Citizens for an Engaged Electorate, we work on issues here in Levy and rural Marion counties. Back when the MCORs legislation was first going through the legislature in 2019, our member Kim Wheeler made a presentation to the group that this was going to be an extremely important issue and we needed to take immediate action on it. Kim has taken the lead on all of the work that's been done here in Levy County. We did join the No Roads to Ruin Coalition. And what we've been doing here is our members have been attending the task force meetings and making public comments whenever it was possible, joining online when it wasn't possible to go in person. We've been attending the county commission meetings to see how, the task force information is being reported back. We've, with the help of Sierra Club, the local group here, we have put on educational sessions for the public around Levy County. We've circulated petitions. We have raised money and put up yard signs against the toll roads. And we've encouraged everyone to write to their task force member with their opinion on the toll roads.
And can I jump in there, Barbara? What are the main concerns you're hearing in those letters and public comments?
So the main concerns we're hearing is that the state's primary engine of economic growth is population growth. And we are a very rural area here. We would possibly be affected by both the Suncoast Connector and the Northern Turnpike here, one or the other. So our county commission sits on both of those task forces. As Ryan mentioned, the forced sprawl is a big issue here. Because we're an agriculture and timber and marine area, this is the nature coast. We don't believe that population growth in our area is the best way to address the future of our area. SB 100, just as a note, does include specific language for adding tolled facilities all along Highway 19. And this is very impactful in our area. Highway 19 cuts through Goethe State Forest, which is one of the last remaining longleaf pine forests here in the U.S. Southeast. It has a unique ecosystem, including some endangered species such as the gopher tortoise. So what we would like, I think, what the majority of people who live here in Levy County would like to see is for the state to take a different approach to economic growth in agricultural areas and to look at the assets that we have. Look at the hunting, the fishing, the marine industry, the agriculture, the timber. We're a breadbasket and a playground. And forcing population growth on top of that is going to be the end of ag. It will be the end of timber. It will be the end of, all sorts of things out here. And that's mostly what we hear from people.
Are you at all comforted by Senate Bill 100, or are you not resting easy?
No, we are not. CEE is not resting easy. We are asking everyone to oppose SB 100. We have been pushing You mentioned earlier those two companion bills that would repeal MCORs entirely. That's SB 1030 and HB 763. And we have been asking everyone to write the committee chairs where those have been referred and ask for hearings.
So where we sit, Friends of the Everglades, SB 100 is less detrimental to the Everglades proper, but part of the reason we wanted to have this conversation today is because Everglades protection isn't good for Florida if it comes at the expense of another ecosystem. So we also have concerns. We share your concerns about SB 100 and really appreciate hearing your on the ground report in terms of residents impacts, community impacts. So thank you, Barbara. I want to turn now to our elected official, Commissioner Rooks, on the line. What are your concerns, Commissioner, about toll roads, impacts of new toll road or expansion or bypasses along US 19 in your county?
Well, Miss Barbara and Ryan touched on a lot of it. But you have to have good planning for long-term growth. And this is going to eliminate that. And then you're going to find that we'll have to have more fire, EMS, and police officers. The cost is going to go up. It's going to have a negative impact that would be inflicted on the aquifer, recharge areas, and coastal water quality for our aquaculture industry. And we have the biggest one in Levy County in the United States and possibly the world. The value of the environmental assets in the county include Manatee Springs, and I think Ryan had all the springs located, and the Swanee River and all the other water bodies, Gothic Forest, Lower Swanee Life Refuge, and the Syracuse State Preserve and Waukesha Bay State Preserve would all be impacted. I don't see anything that'll be coming out good about these toll roads. I see it killing our county. It's not going to bring good jobs. There'll be some, but they will only be here as long as they're doing the work. Levy County residents strive to protect and promote our heritage through lifestyles and livelihoods that came from agriculture, aquaculture, silviculture, hunting, fishing, and eco-friendly tourism. And I don't want to see these families that have had their property in their families for years and years and years have to go through what I went through in the mid-90s when the net ban came into effect. That put me out of business, as did most of the people in Cedar Keys, the fishermen. And I don't want to see that happen to the families that have helped to support, settle Levy County over the years.
Commissioner, I have a question for you. Was it hard to go out on this limb in opposition to MCORs? You've got the former state Senate president who was supportive. What was your thinking as you decided to publicly oppose them?
I promised the people of Levy County that I would always put them first. And that's what I'm trying to do, is follow through on my promise to my people. Levy County's been very good to me over the years. They elected me, and I was the first woman ever elected to the board. The people fired me 4 years later, and I need to be fired because I was not a good commissioner. I had tunnel vision. I tried to do the right thing by the people. And then 4 years later, they asked me to run again, and I ran again, and they put me back in office. And then in 2010, they fired me again, and then brought me back in 2014. and I couldn't walk, I couldn't talk, I couldn't use my arm. I'd had a major stroke. And it's because of the people of Levy County, I feel, that I've gone so far in my recovery.
That's encouraging to hear. And I know that commissioners around the state, county commissioners, grapple with those kinds of dynamics, when to stick your neck out, when not to, if they care about their political career more than the issues. So I do find it encouraging that you've been willing to speak up on this. So I want to remind our audience now that we'll take some of your questions if you'd like to pop them into the chat. And I see one that I'm going to ask Allie to queue up. It relates to the Panther's endangered status, and it's a little bit a field of MCORs, but it's I think relevant here. So Allie, if you can queue up the question, here we go. So this one will go to Amber. Is the Panther's endangered status an element that might help curb rural village development in eastern Collier County? This is proposed by Collier Enterprises. So what do you think, Amber?
Yes, well, the Conservancy is very, very familiar with the proposed development there in eastern Collier County. And I think, hearing the discussion today, I think it's important to sort of to let you know that there are some other additional threats in addition to MCORs that we should all remain vigilant on. Because, at the end of the day, no matter what happens in legislative session, the roller coaster ride that we're on during session, no matter if some or all of the MCORs roads are repealed, it is very apparent that Southwest Florida is under immense threat from roadway development and new communities, mines, and just thinking about the Eastern Collier development posed in the question, there's about 45,000 acres of mines and developments that are proposed in that area of Collier County. And we've seen that would necessitate about 200 miles of new and expanded roadways. We're also familiar with about 20,000 acres of proposed development just north of there in Hendry County. So, this issue of development and roadways, despite whatever may happen in session with MCORs, we're going to need to remain very vigilant on it.
And does the endangered status help enough in situations like MCORs?
You would think that it should, but sadly, no. The agencies are aware that this is Panther habitat. They're, aware of the mortalities in the area of these proposed developments. We're hopeful that they would deny these projects, but we've seen other detrimental projects be permitted despite also being in primary Panther habitat, being an important Panther habitat. So we can hope for the best, but prepare for the worst, I think, on some of these proposals.
Mm-hmm. Right. Endangered species designations are helpful, but it seems that we have to be extremely proactive to use that tool to the benefit of the environment and Floridians at large. We ran into that in a recent case. Friends of the Everglades wasn't involved in, but Center for Biological Diversity and others were, as it related to Lake Okeechobee discharges and impacts on manatees, for example. So the Army Corps of Engineers was not adhering to proper protocol for endangered species evaluations and protections. So it's an uphill battle, and that's why we keep talking about it. And I appreciate your take on that. So we'll take a next question, Allie, if you'd like to queue it up. We're getting some good ones from the audience. Okay, so we got some agreement here. So true. Once you pave it, you can't save it. How can Senate Bill 100 be modified so that it does go far enough to ensure adequate protection of these areas? Ryan, do you feel equipped to answer that one?
I mean, I'll give it a try. It's pretty simple. You just remove the Greenfield, the forced Greenfield development, right? Particularly of concern is running the turnpike from Wildwood over to Crystal River. We put that map up with the spring sheds. You really can't avoid some very sensitive areas. Someone mentioned the 2 clean repeal bills. Sometimes you just have to take them all again admit that you made a mistake and go back to where we were. None of these roads have been shown to be necessary. We have a normal procedure for upgrading our roads. Again, I don't know anyone who's clamoring for more roads, the emergency that we need to pave more things in Florida. Just let the normal DOT process take its course, get the legislature out of it and trying to, force these roads and just repeal it. It's as simple as that.
And will you please define Greenfield for folks who might hear that and think it's a good thing, because it does sound like a pretty image?
Yeah, no. So in other words, we all know that there are roads that need to be improved, right? There's certainly some sections along US 19 that probably need to be improved. There's roads all over our state that need to be improved. We're not against improving roads when they need to be improved. But what is a problem is when you take a new road that's not necessary and you run it through a forest or through some other agricultural land or some other land that's not already developed. Right, because there your impacts, both from the construction and from the accompanying development that come along with it, are going to be much, much greater. So just as I said, we need to be focusing on infill and rebuilding our cities and communities that are in need of it, and not trying to build new communities in the middle of rural areas. Same with our roads. We should be fixing and improving upon our existing transportation system. What we should really be doing is moving towards public transportation. If the legislature wanted to spend their money on something worthwhile that's going to drive forward into the 21st century and make people actually want to move here, as opposed to being the traffic nightmare that so many of our areas are, public transportation systems are the way to go. And you can, you don't end up with the same level of forced sprawl when you build a railroad that goes from one way to another. You add in a high-speed rail line, or you add bus routes or other public transportation options. So, there's lots of options out there besides forcing these roads.
Thank you. And the Greenfield refers to the corridor where the road would be built.
So Greenfield is, so something that's not developed, right? You got brownfield, which means it's already developed, and you got Greenfield, I mean it's not developed. So we want to keep our, where we're growing, both with transportation and with new people, we want to put it where there's already been the impacts, so we can improve in community, not try to force new ones.
Got it. Barbara, I'd like to offer you the opportunity to answer that same question about how Senate Bill 100 can be modified. Do you have anything different to add?
Well, the good part of SB 100 is that it returns the money that was appropriated for MCORS back to its original uses. But other than that, the only way it could be improved is to be replaced by SB 1030 and HB 763.
Okay, and as I said, unfortunately, those bills have no traction in the legislature this year. And in terms of the monetary impacts, I just want to dig deeper on how much these would have cost. So these numbers come from the letter that we sent to Governor DeSantis with the 89 other organizations calling for a veto. So the funding would have grown from $45 million to $90 million in 2020-21, and then about $135 million the following year, and a recurring amount of $140 million starting in 2022-2023 fiscal year. And that's just for planning. So we're talking big money with billions of dollars bonded and limited access highways. So I suppose a silver lining of the COVID pandemic and the subsequent budget crunch is that it did force lawmakers to take a real hard look at their spending and whether this was appropriate. Okay, Allie, do we have additional questions from the audience? All right, we're currently seeing increased manatee deaths due to seagrass loss and decreased water quality. How might MCORS impact this further? Ryan, I see you nodding. I'll let you jump in and see if anyone else wants to piggyback.
Great. So, I mean, it's kind of the same story, but the manatee deaths are due to the seagrass loss. The seagrass loss is largely due to the algae outbreaks, and algae outbreaks are fed by nutrients, and to a great extent, those nutrients are, coming from human sources. So, the majority of the manatee deaths that we're seeing now are in the Indian River Lagoon. So that's obviously far removed from where MCORS is, but it's the same problem. It's the same problem of increasing runoff. Like we're showing that all those springs and rivers in that area all end up feeding into the Gulf of Mexico. We have had major algae outbreaks in the Gulf of Mexico, and there's many things that come together to create a red tide or a blue-green algae outbreak. But certainly one of those is nutrient discharges, and we need to make sure that we're eliminating those to the greatest extent possible, and also putting as much fresh, clean water out into the system as possible, which, the more you suck out of the ground for development, the less you have coming out your springs and rivers going into the Gulf, feeding those estuaries.
Makes sense. Amber, do you have anything to add to that one?
No, I think Ryan captured it. Obviously there's more to think about than just panthers. Gopher tortoises, manatees, and Florida's got the third in the nation in terms of imperiled species. So we have a lot to be concerned about here.
And we don't have to think back too far to recall really devastating images of wildlife, marine life in particular, deaths in Florida. Just 2018, of course, was the biggest beach cleanup in Lee County history due to the confluence of a red tide outbreak and a blue-green algae outbreak. And we're certainly hoping we don't have a repeat of that. And any additional inputs of pollutants, as Ryan explained, could amplify and magnify that problem. So thank you all for the input on that. We have another question, I believe. Yes, this one is from Kim. She says, thanks for this. And what can people do to help? Contact our representatives. What should we ask for? I have one quick thought on that, and then I'd like to hear Commissioner Rook's thoughts. So Friends of the Everglades did circulate an action alert that you can fill out and send a message, type in your address, send a message to your particular state representative on this topic, and it calls for a full repeal in keeping with the No Roads to Ruin Coalition stance. And keep an eye out for that. We'll send that around again after this event. If you registered and attended, you'll get that in your inbox, or you can go to our website, everglades.org, and check it out. So, Commissioner Rooks, what do you think folks can do to help?
I think they need to contact their local elected officials and their representatives and the governor. Call and write. They don't want to get calls, and they don't want to get letters. But if they get that, that's going to give us some more attention. We can't stop. We got to keep fighting. We've been lied to from the very beginning by MCORS. First, they told us it was going to be a hurricane evacuation route. We don't need that. We got roads in Levy County that are that and need work done. And I talked to FDOT, and I'm not in any way trying to burn FDOT, because this was just thrown into their lives. But for one of my roads, County Road 345, to get it widened and resurfaced, it's going to be over $7 million. And they say they won't have the money until 2024 to do that. Somebody said, well, you ought to take it out of your road department budget. That's 3 years. We won't be able to do any kind of other work if we did that. I think a lot of these projects have been pulled and given to MCORS. Now, the planning is interesting, because when they first came to our board, I asked them, I said, have you done any studies? And they said, yes. I said, can I get a copy of them? They said, yeah. So about 2 weeks later, I got 3 books. I started going through them. They're over 20 years old to study. And this is what they're basing their study off of. I took 19 from Inglis all the way to Fannin Springs, and I broke it down, what was on the ground at that time and what's on the ground now. If they're going to do anything to 19, they're going to have to go through Chiefland. Are they going to go through Chiefland, or they're going to bypass it? If they bypass it, that's going to destroy a lot of farms. If they go through it, that's going to destroy a lot of businesses. And these have been in people's families for years. If they go through Chiefland, they close those businesses down, you have a loss of jobs. It doesn't make sense.
I'd like to hear from Barbara on this too, because your group is Citizens for an Engaged Electorate. This is right in your wheelhouse, but I want to ask the question a little differently. As every single one of us knows, we can get burnt out advocating on the same issues week in, week out, hitting dead ends. It does seem like there's been some responsiveness to the concerns about MCORs. But Barbara, when you advocate on MCORs or any issue, how do you keep going?
Oh, how do we keep going? As Commissioner Rook said, we can't stop. That's the reality. If we stop, we've lost. We just need to bolster each other and make sure that everybody who's involved knows that this work matters very much, and that those people who are helping with this work are greatly appreciated. Maintaining our rural areas is extremely important, and there isn't enough that we can do, quite frankly, to make sure that the state changes the way it sees things for the future, or even begins looking to the future in terms of our rural lands here in Florida. There are times when we feel beaten down. There are times when we've been absolutely jubilant. Thank you, Commissioner Rooks, for the resolution, the no-build resolution against MCORs in Levy County. I think if we had not won that resolution, it would have set us back quite a bit. But every one of these little successes in this work propels us forward.
Thank you for that. So I want to pull the map back up here so we can all reflect on what we're talking about with the few minutes we have left. So the Suncoast Connector, the Northern Turnpike Corridor, and the Southwest Central Florida Connector were the three original proposals. Again, Senate Bill 100, which passed the state Senate just yesterday and is awaiting a companion bill in the House, would scale back these impacts but not completely eliminate them. It does apparently remove the Southwest Central Florida element, but our concerns in the Big Bend area and the Nature Coast remain. So with that map in mind, and we can go ahead and stop sharing it now, Allie, I'd like to go around the horn and talk a little bit with all of you to get some final words on what we can do, or your outlook. Let's put it this way. What's your outlook on MCORs? We have a month left of legislative session, and what will you be doing to ensure a good outcome? So let's start with Ryan.
Well, we're going to keep working to try to get SB 100 improved. I think, it's clearly a priority for the Senate, but that doesn't mean anything for the House. So we'll have to see what happens with the horse trading at the end of session. Just kind of as a side note, there is a bill coming up on Monday, which is Senate Bill 1522, which is the Blue-Green Algae Task Force Implementation Bill. If you're concerned about water quality all around the state, from the Everglades to the springs, that's a good, important bill that has some protections from the Blue-Green Algae Task Force. So we're going to keep trying to make progress on protecting water, advocating for more money for land conservation. I think, one of the things that's been lost is that as we develop and build, we need to be conserving land, and we're not doing that anymore. The entire equation's flipped to only development. The Senate's proposal of $50 million is completely inadequate and is only for conservation easements. So we really need to pressure the legislature that if they can afford to spend this much money building toll roads, they can certainly find $400 or $500 million a year to conserve lands across our state.
Thanks, Ryan. We really appreciate your perspective on the springs and beyond. Amber, final words from you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we'll just be continuing to work with our No Roads to Ruin Coalition, the other 70 organizations, and after session, there's going to be more work to be done, I'm sure, on protecting our rural lands. As I mentioned, they're continue to be under threat not only from MCORs but from other threats in panther habitat, and so you can find more information about those. Some of those decisions are underway now as well on our website, conservancy.org. So plenty of work to do.
Thanks. And No Roads to Ruin is noroadstoruin.org as well. Commissioner Rooks, final words.
The fight isn't over. I don't think that they understand rural counties. I was thinking earlier, we don't have any traffic lights in my hometown. There may be 6 in Chiefland. There's not that many in Williston. There's none in Raleigh. There's none in, there may be 1 in Raleigh. But this isn't like Tampa Bay. We don't want to be like Tampa Bay. We don't want to be Orlando. When I go down to Orlando, they're still doing work on the same roads that they were doing 10 years ago. I don't want to be like that.
Thank you, Commissioner. And in the 30 seconds or so we have left, Barbara, we'll have you sum it up.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to echo what Ryan said. None of the legislation happens in a vacuum. We will be doing our best in this area to get SB 100 reworked or get a House version that repeals MCORs. But at the same time, we're working very hard on SB 62, the CSSB 62, which is a bill that would do away with our regional planning councils.
Yes.
Which means we would no longer be having this conversation. The state would dictate what we're doing and we wouldn't even be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. And thank you for all the work your group does on meaningful planning in Florida and attempting to hold the line on bad proposals. A lot of what we all do is defense, and we've got our defensive work cut out for us in the remaining weeks of legislative session. I can't thank you all enough for joining. Thank you to those of you who watch this live or are watching on the replay. If you'd like to see the replay, you can check it out at everglades.org. And again, for more information on the No Roads to Ruin Coalition, go to noroadstoruin.org. Thanks very much, everyone. We'll talk with you soon. Have a great day.
Thank you.